I just spent a few months making a small, free browser game heavily inspired by Balatro. It's called Line Break, it's out now, and you can play it in your browser. Link to the game is in the video description. In this video, I want to talk about my experiences developing the game, and specifically about how a central theme, or a lack thereof, can affect the development process. So I really like Balatro. It's probably the game I played the most back in 2025, and I've completed all the difficulties with all the decks available in the game. I know I'm late to the party on making a Balatro-like, but I really like the genre, and this thought popped into my head that I couldn't really shake. The idea was to make the smallest, most basic version of Balatro I could think of, drawing lines on a grid and scoring points. This was in the back of my head for a while, so when I finished the latest big milestone of my main project, I decided to take a break and make this small game just so I could let it go. The plan was to take a few weeks and make a kind of game jam-sized project, but polish it up a bit, add a tutorial and a goal, and then release it for free. So that's what I did. Except it took a few months instead of a few weeks, but we don't need to talk about that. In the game, you draw paths on a grid. Nodes on the grid give you mult score, and edges give you base score. Multiply them together to get your final score. If you've played Balatro, this is nothing new. Over time, you gain upgrades and downgrades that affect how you play, and that increases or decreases your ability to gain good scores. There are talismans that give you bonus mult for every 90-degree corner in your path. There are upgrades that increases the grid size, or that allow you to draw longer paths. And there are curses that disable the corner nodes of the grid, and so on. If you can complete 18 rounds, each with a higher score to beat, you win the game. I wanted to keep this as simple as possible, so there is no economy or inventory system in the game. And the visuals are very bare bones, kind of like a Sudoku or a crossword puzzle. There is no theme and no story. And we will discuss later whether this was a good idea or not. Parts of the development process went really well. Mainly my very playtest-driven design process. I started by making the most basic version of what I was envisioning in my head, and then immediately had a friend play while I watched and took notes. I tried to focus as much as possible on any parts of the game they found confusing, where information was missing or where the info they got was ambiguous or unclear. I fixed everything and tested with the next person in the friend group and so on. For this project, I've not had any public playtest, only one-on-one sessions with people I know, where I could watch in real time while they think aloud, and where I was able to ask questions in the moment whenever I needed to. This was a big help, and it made me stay on track the whole time while building the game, instead of having to redo a bunch of stuff at the end. After each playtest session, I also asked one question. What would you work on next if you were me? This was nice, since it helped me get a sense of what each player thought was the most important at the time. Of course, I didn't always immediately do exactly what they said, but it gave me a bit of external help with prioritization, which can be hard when you're a solo developer. It was also very interesting to see that I got such different answers from different players. Some people wanted more power-ups to add variation and more interesting builds. Others wanted a more clear goal instead of just playing to get a high score, and some wanted music and sound effects. I knew from this that music and sound was gonna be important, but I still waited with that for last. It takes time for me to browse, record and process audio, and with the amount of changes the game was going through all the time, I knew I would have to redo stuff later if I added it too early. And in hindsight, I can say this was probably the right move. So overall the process went smoothly, and the game turned out pretty good in my opinion. But like I've been hinting towards, there's one thing I think would have made the process easier and made the game better, a clear theme. I wanted to keep things simple, and I thought story, art and dialogue would just complicate things. I now think this is wrong. Sure, you might need to add some more visuals to really make the theme obvious to the player, but once that's there, it's a foundation to base all other concepts on. For example, in my game, there are two talisman powers, Frugal and Abundance. One of them increases your score based on the number of untouched nodes in the grid, and the other increases your score based on the amount of fuel you have left after drawing your path. Before, the number of untouched nodes was called unconsumed nodes, and fuel was called nodes left. Regardless of what kind of keyword tooltip I added, players got these concepts mixed up all the time. I ended up renaming nodes left to fuel to avoid the problem. But now the game has talismans, curses, upgrades and fuel. It feels like a hodgepodge of random things that don't fit together at all. And it is this way because I had to make everything distinct in order to avoid confusion, while using the most generic or theme-agnostic names possible for every concept. In one of my favorite GDC talks, Ben Brode talks about how Hearthstone doesn't have a story, and how that's okay. According to Ben, it's almost as good as having the best story there is. And just because Hearthstone doesn't have a story, it still has a setting and a vibe, which is something that my game doesn't. I also know that Alan Hazelden, the creator of A Monster's Expedition and many other great puzzle games, has talked on the Draknek and Friends podcast how he uses the themes of his games to come up with mechanics. Kind of like, this game has monsters riding a train. What kind of monsters could there be? How about a zombie? What would a zombie do while riding a train? Rather than coming up with a nice game mechanic and then deciding on a monster that would fit the mechanic after. So imagine if my game had a theme. Perhaps you could be competing in a calligraphy competition, or plan a route for a taxi to get the most money during a trip around the city, or you could be a wizard creating magic runes to cast spells. If I went with either one of these, my fuel concept would be ink, fuel or mana, depending on the theme I picked. The point is it would fit better with the rest of the game, while still being distinct and unambiguous. I set out to make a small game and release it, and that's what I did. I'm proud of the game for what it is, and with the time I spent on it. Although I think a good theme would have helped make the game even better in a lot of ways. The theme would have tied together terminology, visuals, sound effects and music. It might also have helped me brainstorm new mechanics that would fit the game. If I were to flesh the game out further, I would add a theme for sure. So, I hope that this was interesting and that you learned something along the way. If you want, you can play the game over on itch. Take care and have a good one. Peace.